5 years ago, my life revolved around the slam poetry scene. It was more than just a hobby. It was my passion, my escape, and my way of making sense of the world. For those who don't know, slam poetry is a competitive art form where poets perform their work and are judged by the audience. It's raw, emotional, and deeply personal. I thrived in this environment, finding solace and community among like-minded individuals who shared my love for words. My city had a small but vibrant poetry scene, and I had quickly made a name for myself. But I wanted more. I wanted to push my career further and reach a wider audience. So, I began traveling to nearby cities where I could perform. This led me to Charlotte, North Carolina, a place known for its robust slam poetry community. Charlotte was a revelation. The local team venue was intense, with fierce competition to join the squad that would represent the city at national competitions. I poured my heart into every performance, and soon enough, I was welcomed into the local crew. This opened doors to longer stays and features at various venues around the city. One of the most popular spots was a bar known for its lively crowd and great atmosphere for selling CDs. That's where I met him. Let's call him Mike. He worked as a barback, a job that kept him busy but also allowed him to mingle with the patrons. Occasionally, he'd get on stage and share his poems, which, to be honest, were far from impressive. But he was the brother of the host, and everyone seemed to like him. Mike started flirting with me more and more. At first, it was just harmless banter. I was new in town, looking for acceptance and camaraderie, so I didn't mind the attention. I accepted the drinks he sent over, smoked his weed with the group in the stockroom between sets, and hung out at parties and events. But something always kept me wary. Despite my occasional lapses into seeking love and acceptance wherever I could find it, there was an instinctual part of me that urged caution. Over time, Mike and I became friends. He started calling and texting me more often, poking me on Facebook daily, and sending messages about wanting to be more than friends. He talked about finding a snow bunny, yes, I'm white and he's black, and settling down again. Despite his persistent advances, I never entertained the idea. There was something about the crazy look in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. Life in Charlotte was a whirlwind of performances, late-night parties, and new connections. The poetry scene was thriving, and I felt like I was finally finding my place. But there was always that lingering unease when it came to Mike. He had a way of making everyone around him feel comfortable, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him. Eventually, I received an offer to move to Denver and take up a position teaching poetry while working at a friend's law firm. It was an opportunity one couldn't pass up, and I was excited about the change. Denver was a new start, a chance to build my career and leave behind the unease that Mike had brought into my life. 2 years into my new life in Denver, as Christmas approached, I received a call from an old friend in Charlotte. The news she relayed left me in shock. Mike had found his snow bunny and gotten married. At first, they seemed happy, but things quickly took a dark turn. Their fights became more frequent and public, often requiring friends to physically separate them. My friend recounted the last time she saw them together. Mike had pushed his wife, who retaliated by throwing a drink in his face and scratching his neck deep enough to draw blood. After they were pulled apart, my friend sat with Mike, smoking a cigarette. She jokingly said, "You guys are going to kill each other." Around Christmas of the previous year, Mike's wife stopped coming to their bi-weekly events. He claimed they were on a break. As time went by, no one really questioned her absence, assuming she was taking a break from the scene to distance herself from Mike. However, her parents hadn't heard from her since Thanksgiving, and their calls to Mike were brushed off with reassurances that everything was fine. It wasn't until a week after Christmas when her parents, knowing their daughter would never miss a holiday without at least a call, contacted the police for a wellness check. The officers arrived, knocked on the door, and were let in by Mike. When asked where his wife was, he casually replied, "She's in the bedroom." The officers followed him to the room, where they found her body. She had been dead for weeks, rotting in their bed. And to make matters even more horrifying, Mike had also killed her little dog. During this time, Mike continued to attend events, host hip-hop nights, and even publish a blog about making marriage work on a local organization's site. He never let on that every night he was going home to a house of horrors. The sickest part of it all was that he had a daughter from another relationship whom he got to celebrate every other holiday with. That Christmas, they opened gifts, had dinner, and cuddled up on the couch, less than 100 feet from the decaying body of her stepmother. When I heard this, a shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't help but think about all the times I had spent with Mike, how I had always kept him at arm's length because of that gut feeling. What would have happened if I had ever taken him up on his offers to get closer? I knew one thing for sure. My instincts had saved me from a potential nightmare. Moving forward from that call, I found it difficult to shake off the shadows of the past. The news about Mike and his wife haunted me. It was a stark reminder of how appearances can be deceiving and how important it is to trust your instincts. In Denver, I threw myself into my work and poetry. Teaching was rewarding, and my students were a bright spot in my life. The poetry scene in Denver was vibrant, and I quickly became a part of it, sharing my experiences and stories with a new audience. But the memory of Mike lingered in the back of my mind, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. One night, I was performing at a local venue, pouring my heart out on stage. The applause was deafening, and the energy in the room was electric. After the performance, I was approached by a fellow poet who had heard about my time in Charlotte. We chatted for a while, and he mentioned how the poetry community had changed since I left. The story of Mike's crime had spread, and it had cast a long shadow over the once thriving scene. My name is Alex, and although my story is far from over, the majority of what I'm about to share happened around 12 years ago, back in 2009. I was living with my folks in a quiet neighborhood we'd moved into when I was 13. It wasn't long after we arrived that I discovered the woods across the road. Those woods became my sanctuary, a place of solace amidst the bullying I faced at school and the constant turmoil at home. The neighborhood wasn't teeming with kids. The few that were around were older and, frankly, not very friendly. The hostility I encountered made me a very nervous and anxious kid. Any free time I had was spent alone, searching for peace. One day, curiosity got the best of me, and I ventured into the woods. To my surprise, there didn't seem to be anyone else out there. This solitude brought an unexpected sense of safety, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I stumbled upon a small circle of cedar trees that formed a secret open area. It was like a hidden clubhouse, and I made it my own. As time went on, I began spending more and more time in those trees. One night, I even fell asleep out there by accident and woke up the next morning, worried about the reaction from my parents. To my dismay and strange relief, they hadn't even noticed my absence. This was the only excuse I needed to start camping out in my clubhouse regularly. I knew I needed some camping supplies. Bringing things from home didn't cut it. They wore out fast. Asking my parents for money was out of the question. So I started going door to door, offering to mow lawns. I'd never mowed a lawn in my life, but that didn't matter. The real problem was finding a lawnmower. I began sneaking my dad's mower out for jobs, but eventually got caught and took a beating for it. Fortunately, I had saved enough money to buy a really terrible used mower of my own. It wasn't much, but it was safer than using my dad's. Once I remade the money I'd lost, I hopped on my barely functional bike and rode the 5 miles to a dinky army surplus store. I emerged with an Alice pack stuffed with various supplies I thought I needed. I was so excited to try them out that I skipped a whole week of school to camp out in my clubhouse. It became an addictive hobby, but it was more than that. It was my only source of safety and happiness. For the next several years, I went to school just enough to avoid trouble. Every afternoon, I'd go straight from school to my clubhouse in the woods. By now, I saw those woods as my own territory. Anyone else entering them was an invader in my mind. And when that day came, I didn't hesitate to strike back. One Sunday afternoon, I'd been camping out all weekend and was on my way to the creek to get water. Across the creek, about 50 yards away, was an almost deserted road. I rarely saw anyone use it, but that day, I caught sight of a parked camper. 2 men were walking in and out of it, seemingly oblivious to my presence. When I returned a few hours later, they were still there, drinking beers and shooting guns aimlessly. This made me furious, but when a stray bullet struck the water just feet from me, I'd had enough. I ran the mile back home and called the sheriff, pretending to be an anonymous tipster. I made up a story about getting lost and encountering the men, saying they had threatened me with their guns. Looking back, I realize how wrong this was, but I was young and angry. One morning, as I prepared for school, I overheard a news report about a big meth lab bust. Acting on an anonymous tip, sheriff's deputies found 2 men shooting guns on a country road. The camper turned out to be a mobile meth lab. The men were taken into custody and were being held pending bail hearings. I knew this had to be the result of my call. The seriousness of the situation scared me, but I was confident no one would know I was the tipster. For the next year, I even followed the case closely. About 3 months before their sentencing hearing, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. It simply said, "You messed with the wrong people, kid." A jolt of ice-cold fear shot through me, but I still doubted it was from the 2 men. Any doubt I had was removed when another letter arrived the next week, far clearer. "You better pray we get time served." I was too terrified at the time to wonder how they knew it was me. I'm still not sure how they identified me, but the how no longer mattered. The letters continued to arrive. When the day of the hearing came, the news was not good. Both men were felons found with multiple firearms. Adding on the manufacturing charge, they faced a minimum of 10 years each. The judge, not feeling generous, gave both men 20 years. I was sure my days on earth were numbered. I stopped going to school and spent all my time in the woods. I wasn't foolish enough to think it would keep me safe, but if I was going to die, I wanted to die somewhere I loved. A strange thing happened, though. The death I was expecting never came. Month after month, I became more confident that it had all been a joke or an intimidation tactic. My life flew by, and the last 10 years have been a series of ups and downs. The meth heads have been the last thing on my mind. Then last week, a new anonymous letter showed up at my apartment. It read, "You better write a will. The end is close at hand." I involuntarily dropped it like a hot potato. My girlfriend, Emily, was with me and witnessed it. She picked up the letter and read it. I could tell she was concerned, but I played it off as a prank and refused to explain. And just like that, a ghost from my past reappeared into the present. You can probably guess what this unwanted news has done to me. I feel like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder everywhere I go. I'm terrified these monsters may go after Emily and our newborn child, Jake. Going to the cops was a brief consideration, but without any proof of who the sender is, I know there's not much they can do. My options seemed to be limited. Without anyone else to talk to, I'm anonymously emailing this in to tell my story. I'm not sure why. It could be because of the anonymity of the internet. There's not much more I can say other than to tell you all to be careful of the choices you make as a child. Wish me luck, and please pray for me and my family. The days following the arrival of the letter were a blur of anxiety and dread. Every shadow seemed menacing, every stranger a potential threat. I tried to keep a brave face for Emily and Jake, but inside, I was a mess. Sleep eluded me, and when it did come, it was filled with nightmares of faceless men breaking into our home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on our porch, trying to gather my thoughts. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, but even the pleasant aroma couldn't soothe my nerves. Emily joined me, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You need to tell me what's going on, Alex," she said softly, her eyes filled with concern. I took a deep breath, knowing I couldn't keep her in the dark any longer. I told her everything: the woods, the meth lab, the letters. By the time I finished, her face had gone pale. "We need to go to the police," she insisted. "I've thought about it, Emily, but without proof, there's not much they can do. Besides, I don't even know if these guys are out yet, or if it's just someone messing with me." Emily was silent for a moment, then spoke with determination. "We can't just wait for something to happen. We need to take precautions." That night, we began making plans. We installed security cameras around the house, got a new alarm system, and I even bought a gun. A decision that weighed heavily on me, but the need to protect my family outweighed my personal discomfort with firearms. Despite our efforts, the sense of impending doom didn't leave me. Each day felt like walking on the edge of a cliff, never knowing when or if I'd fall. Then, one afternoon, while at work, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, and the message sent chills down my spine. Tick-tock. Panic surged through me. I rushed home, half expecting to find something terrible. To my relief, Emily and Jake were fine, but my anxiety was through the roof. Emily, seeing the state I was in, decided it was time to involve someone else. She called her brother, Matt, a former Marine and someone who didn't take threats lightly. Matt arrived the next day, his presence a mixture of calm and resolve. He listened to our story, his face betraying no emotion. When we finished, he nodded and stood up. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said firmly. "But until then, you're not alone." Having Matt around brought a sense of security I hadn't felt in years. He helped us set up more robust security measures and even reached out to some of his old contacts for advice. But despite these precautions, the fear lingered. One night, about a week after Matt's arrival, I awoke to the sound of breaking glass. Heart pounding, I grabbed the gun from the nightstand and quietly made my way to the living room. Matt was already there, his own weapon drawn. We found a brick on the floor, wrapped in another ominous note: "Last warning." Emily appeared, holding Jake, her face stricken with fear. "We need to leave," she whispered. Matt agreed. "Pack some essentials. We'll stay at a friend's place for a while." We quickly gathered our belongings and left, our home no longer feeling like the sanctuary it once was. Matt's friend, a fellow Marine named David, welcomed us into his secluded cabin in the woods. It was a temporary solution, but it provided the immediate safety we desperately needed. Days turned into weeks at the cabin. David's presence, along with Matt's, was a constant reassurance, but the isolation weighed heavily on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were merely postponing the inevitable. Then, one evening, as we sat around the cabin's small living room, Matt received a call. His face grew serious as he listened. Then he hung up and turned to us. "We've got a lead," he announced. An old contact recognized the description of the men. "They're out of prison and back in town." A mix of relief and dread washed over me. We finally had confirmation, but it meant the threat was real and immediate. Matt and David began planning our next steps, deciding it was time to confront the situation head-on. The following morning, we returned to our home, ready to face whatever awaited us. With Matt and David by our side, we felt more prepared. We contacted the local police, sharing everything we knew, and they agreed to keep a close watch on our place. Life slowly began to regain a semblance of normalcy, though the shadow of fear never fully dissipated. Weeks passed without incident, and I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. But deep down, I knew we could never fully let our guard down. One evening, as we sat on the porch, Emily leaned into me. "We'll get through this," she said softly. "Together." I nodded, grateful for her strength and the support of those around us. The past 12 years had been a roller coaster, but through it all, I had found a family worth fighting for. And no matter what came next, I knew I wasn't alone. In the late 70s, my mom was in her 20s and living on her own for the first time in a brand new apartment complex in Houston, Texas. It was an exciting time for her, filled with independence and the sense of possibility that comes with striking out on your own. The apartment complex was so new that the phone service wasn't even fully operational yet, and her building was among the last to get connected. Mom had just returned from a vacation in Cancun, a much-needed break from her routine. She came back relaxed, tanned, and with a hefty grocery list to restock her empty fridge and pantry. It was a hot, sticky day in Houston, the kind where the air feels heavy and sweat trickles down your back just standing still. She made several trips back and forth from her car, each time unlocking and relocking her front door, carrying bags of food and supplies. On one of these trips, she noticed a familiar face standing outside her neighbor's door. His name was Sven, a striking Scandinavian man she had seen hanging out with her neighbors, a young couple who lived next door. He was tall, with chiseled features and an easy smile, the kind of person who drew attention effortlessly. My mom had met him a few times at casual get-togethers and found him friendly and charming. As she made her final trip up the stairs, laden with grocery bags, she and Sven made eye contact again. He smiled and asked, "Are they home?" nodding towards the neighbor's apartment. My mom replied that she didn't know and mentioned she hadn't seen them around. Sven explained that they had plans to go to a movie together, but guessed they were running late. Feeling sympathetic, my mom offered to let him wait inside her apartment until the neighbors got home. She would have let him use her phone, but the service was still out. Sven accepted her invitation with a grateful smile, and they walked into her apartment together. My mom is a cautious woman. Even in her 20s, she had encountered enough creepy situations to always be on her guard. She always locked doors, kept an eye on her surroundings, and questioned people's motives. But Sven seemed harmless enough. She figured she knew him well enough from their previous encounters to trust him, at least for a little while. Sven made himself comfortable on the couch while my mom busied herself with putting away the groceries. She offered him a can of soda, calling out, "Do you want some Coke?" To her surprise, Sven replied, "No, thanks, I brought my own." Puzzled, she peeked around the doorway to see Sven arranging lines of white powder on her coffee table. Her heart skipped a beat. She walked into the room and, trying to keep her voice steady, said, "I think you should leave." Sven looked up, an amused grin spreading across his face. "Suit yourself," he said, lowering his face to the table with a rolled-up dollar bill to his nose. My mom felt a wave of disbelief and confusion. How had this seemingly nice guy turned into such a blatant intruder in her home? She repeated, more firmly this time, "You need to leave now." Sven scoffed and reached for her arm, his grip tightening as she tried to pull away. But my mom wasn't one to be easily intimidated. She yanked her arm free and said, "I'm a big, strong girl, and I can take care of myself. Leave. Now." Sven seemed taken aback, impressed even, and he finally stood up, his grin faltering. He left her apartment without further incident, but the encounter left my mom shaken. She locked the door behind him and stood there, her mind racing. She looked out the window and saw Sven standing next to a shiny, expensive-looking car parked perpendicular behind hers, effectively blocking her in. Panic set in. Her phone was out, and she had no way to call for help. She waited by the window, keeping an eye on Sven. After what felt like an eternity, he finally got into his car and drove away. My mom grabbed her purse and keys, bolted out the door, and ran down the stairs. She jumped into her car, locking the doors instantly. Just as she thought she was safe, she saw Sven's car in her rearview mirror, blocking her in again. He grinned at her from his window, clearly enjoying the game. My mom, however, wasn't about to back down. She realized that his expensive car was worth a lot more than her beat-up old one. With a determined grin, she slammed her car into reverse, speeding backward as fast as she could. Sven, fearing damage to his precious car, pulled out of the way just in time, allowing her to escape. She drove out of the complex with Sven close behind. She merged onto Highway 59, a busy freeway cutting through the heart of Houston, hoping to lose him in the traffic. Sven kept pace, swerving and changing lanes to stay right behind her. Up ahead, she saw a wall of traffic and swerved in front of a braking car, narrowly avoiding a collision. Sven got stuck behind the slowing traffic, giving my mom a chance to get away. She sped to a friend's house, banging on the door until they let her in. They watched out the window, but Sven never showed up. My mom had managed to lose him, but the experience left her rattled. She told her friends and family what happened, but most of them thought she was overreacting. They knew how cautious she was and figured she was just letting her imagination run wild. A few months later, while browsing a magazine rack, my mom saw Sven's face on the cover of Houston City magazine. She picked it up and read the story. Sven, who worked at a notorious magazine, had been arrested for assaulting multiple women. He would overpower them, tie them up, and subject them to all sorts of demeaning acts. He was convicted of assaulting 2 women, but there were many more victims whose cases lacked sufficient proof. Soon after, my mom's neighbors moved out abruptly, leaving no trace. She still wonders if they were somehow involved in Sven's actions, or just as unaware as she had been. The experience left a lasting impression on her, a stark reminder of how quickly a seemingly normal situation could turn dangerous. The encounter with Sven haunted my mom for a long time. One day, while chatting with a neighbor in her new apartment complex, my mom learned that Sven had been sentenced to several years in prison. The news brought a measure of relief, but also a stark realization of how close she had come to being one of his victims. She felt a mix of gratitude and guilt, grateful for her escape, but guilty for the other women who hadn't been so lucky. Years passed, and my mom eventually met my dad, a kind and caring man who brought a new sense of safety and stability into her life. They got married and started a family, building a life filled with love and laughter. But even as she embraced her new life, the experience with Sven remained a cautionary tale she shared with us, her children.